Yes, the poppies are definitely the stars of the painting, but let's not forget about the supporting cast, which was practically lots and lots of different little plants. There was a lot that went into creating this painting right here, a lot of little details. But why did I choose to paint so many insignificant little plants and weeds and so on? Pretty simple, they were there. Hello and welcome, my name is Charlambos, I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. And today I am going to show you how I painted the red poppies in my painting. Whoa, there's more than just poppies, I'm afraid. And this is a very lengthy video. In a way, I split it into two. The first half is practically all the little plants. In this section, I show you how I did the stems, the bulbs, and the little seed pods that poppies leave behind when their petals fall off. And also lots and lots of thorns. Anyhow, I will explain more in the video. I felt if I didn't include all these little plants, it would have kind of been like ignoring reality. And they were there. And in ways, I wanted to capture how the poppies appeared in my village. And honestly, there were times where I felt I was lost. Especially sections like this, where there's lots and lots of stems and grass. And some of the plants like this, I have no idea what they are. If anyone can identify them, please let me know in the comments. But they were significant enough for me to include. And then of course, the second half will be practically all the poppies. I go into detail on how I paint each flower. Things like striations, different tones of reds, and even little water drops. Those were quite easy to do, but very nice to include. A few things I want to point out during the demonstration. I tried to include a photo of what I am painting at that moment. Hopefully this gives you an idea of how I analyze a photo and how I paint what I see. And you'll notice I did simplify the painting. It was pretty complex. But besides the poppies, I tried to capture as many of the plants as possible. Anyway, I don't want to waste any more time. Let's get started with the demonstration. I began this painting by doing a acrylic underpainting. It ended up being very helpful because I was able to lay out the composition very quickly thanks to the dry time of acrylic paint. The bright yellowish green are some of the bulbs and plants that were in the painting, and the orange are actually the poppies. I used orange because it was going to help make the red a lot more brighter later. And to start off the background where the hills are, I just laid out some dark greens. I have a video on how I did the background in acrylic if you want to check it out. Link will be in the description. When I did do the acrylic underpainting, I did focus on doing the plants and the poppies first. The reason behind this was so they could stand out with a bright underpainting. Then I painted the dark hills afterwards. But as for the oil part, I did the background first. Besides hills, this painting also had some clouds in the background. I did a separate video on just the clouds if you want to check it out. Link will be in the description. But besides the sky and the clouds, there were also some hills in the background. But I kept them blurry just like the photo, so the focus is on the plants and the poppies, of course. But to paint them, they were not just a solid color. There were lots of variations of greens. Some light, but mostly dark. I tried to paint the colors where I saw them, in a way like patches of different variations of greens. Then I would use a dry brush to smooth out and soften the edges of where the colors meet, and in some areas try to create some transition. But I tried to have some visible texture because those hills have lots of trees and bushes. Later in the painting, I will change some of the lights and darks. It will come down to where the plants are and to try to make some stand out. More on that later. Something very important I did for the hills was to soften the tree line of where the hills met the sky in the painting. This was best done while the paint was wet. If necessary, I would have to try to remix the color of the sky and apply it gently on the tree line to soften those edges. Also, I went against the photo. There were some fields visible, but they were too bright and they would have ended up being a distraction in the painting. Plus, I did start to begin to apply some darker darks in order to make some of the stems stand out, as well as the plants and poppies. Some other little details I included in the background were some dirt paths. It is not just trees and bushes back there. There's actually a dirt trail for cars and also people to walk on. Though the trees hide most of it, there are some visible patches. I included them in the painting, but once again I made them very blurry since they are in the background. Though I haven't started to actually paint the plants or the poppies, doing the background gives me an opportunity to correct some things, such as straighten some of the stems and correct some of the flowers and plants. Also, since the paint is wet in the background, it gives me the opportunity to do some subtle soft edges. Therefore, I started to actually paint some of the plants. I'm not going into detail just yet. The focus is really the edges of where the plants and the hills meet. Though the plants are in the foreground, I do not want the edges to be too harsh. And this is the best time to dry brush while the paint is still wet. Even though the subject matter are the red poppies, there are a lot of other plants in the composition. Besides grass, some of them are actually different life stages of an actual poppy. They start off with just basically leaves, then they sprout out thorny bulbs, which later flourish to the actual red poppy petals. And then unfortunately, the petals fall and the center pod remains, which actually has the seeds. I'm not an expert in poppies, but I tried to depict what I saw as accurately as possible, in hopes that those that are familiar with the flower can identify these life stages. That is why I spent quite a bit of time and effort to detail these features. To me, they're just as significant as the red poppies themselves, and by including them, it will add to the realism. Of these different life stages of a poppy, the most difficult ones to do were the bulbs. Besides being thorny, they also had bumps. When I first analyzed the photo, I knew these were going to be a little tricky to paint. To simplify what I did, I first established the overall shape of the bulb. Then I tried using lights and darks to give it a sense of volume. After that, I paid attention to the bumps very carefully and used lights and darks on a smaller scale to do each bump. I figured one of the last things I would do to make them more believable is add the thorns at the very end. But I did paint the thorns that were on the edge of the bulb. Since I was still painting the background, it was the perfect opportunity to soften the thorns and make them recede into the background. It makes sense because you want the thorns that are more towards the viewer to be more clear and crisper, and the ones that wrap around that are on the sides to be on the softer blurry side. The goal is to create the illusion of volume. That way the bulbs do not look like 2D cutouts. This required multiple attempts to get right, especially for the thorns that were very bright and the highlights that are on the bumps on the bulb. Later on the video, when the paint is dry, I go back into them, so stay tuned. As for the grass that's behind that bulb, it was actually quite easy to do. I just used a liner brush to draw lines of green, different variations of course, and then I used some of the background color to, in a way, blur them. I painted between the grass blades and then softened the edges. I did not want them to stand out too much, but I wanted the viewer to know that there's grass present in the painting. I'm gonna speed through this section because it's just painting thorns. They were very tedious. Most of the stems and poppy bulbs had them. I used a lot of different types of brushes to create them. Everything from 3-0 to 10-0, both liners and also rounds. But a particular old brush was actually quite helpful. One of my black Sable Da Vinci brushes was missing a few hairs. This kind of helped me paint some of the more delicate thorns. So in a way, I'm glad I did not throw away that brush. And also because the paint was still wet in the background, it was easy to paint the thorns and give them a soft touch. Later, of course, I will paint some sharper ones when the paint is dry. And if I made a mistake, I did not worry. I would just use the background color nearby to correct the thorns, whether just to sharpen them or outright eliminate them. And if I wanted to give them a soft touch, I would do a gentle dry brush over them. Oh, and did I say they were tedious to do? Besides poppies and some grass, there was another plant that I have no idea what it is. All I know that it was tall, thin, and had some elongated pods. Those pods were attached to thin vines, but a very interesting feature that they had was the long whiskers. Even though I did not know what they were, I painted them the way I saw them and used lights and darks in order to give them a sense of volume, but I have to say I had fun painting the whiskers. And then there's the last stage of a poppy, the pod. These were very simple to paint. In some ways they remind me of an acorn stuck on a stem. Plus they even have a cap on top. I used lights and darks in order to define them and used directional strokes, especially for the body of the pod. As for the cap, they had some curvature and were not perfectly flat on the top. And lastly, in order to make sure that they stood out from the background, I would add some highlights on the sides. But if the background was on the lighter side, I would use some darks instead. The ultimate goal was to have a separation of the foreground from the background. And in situations like this, I do not go based on the photo, but what makes sense to pull off an optical illusion. That is why I would use highlights when it comes to a dark background, or just make the edges dark when the background is light. Sometimes it's a combination of both, even on the same side. It all depends on the situation. Now let's get into detail on how to paint one single poppy bulb before it blooms. I first start painting a body of green for the bulb itself as well as the stem. Because I did an underpainting first, it helped establish where it goes. The stem is not straight, it has some curvature. I was trying to be as careful as possible, but I had to use some blue tone from the sky as well as some white tones from the clouds in order to correct the stem here and there. But the most important thing I wanted to depict overall is that this plant has a sense of volume. Besides painting the lights and darks to give the bulb some shape and form, the stem was also round. It is not flat. In order to give it a 3D illusion, I painted the edges a little darker, especially on the left side, since it was the opposite of the sun's light. Now let's have some fun painting the actual bulb. As I mentioned previously, these were quite tricky to paint. It's all because the surface area is far from being smooth. But just like before, the first step was to establish a sense of volume using lights and darks. After that, I carefully painted each little bump. They also have a sense of volume. So I used dark greens in order to do the casted shadows and dark spots, and brighter greens for the highlights and the area where the sun was hitting them. I switched it up from painting little dots of highlights and then also doing the casted shadows here and there. All this while the paint was still wet. In some scenarios, I would go back with a tiny brush in order to do some micro dry brushing, in order to smooth out the transition from lights to darks and help establish the bumpy look. I always kept in the back of my mind that at the very end, I could always go back when the paint is dry and correct issues I'm having while the paint is still wet. For the very bright spots, I would use almost pure titanium white with just a little bit of cadmium yellow. Now, the real fun begins, which is painting the little thorns. I started to do them while the paint was actually still wet. Even though this was kinda a little obstacle, it actually kinda helped me establish some softer thorns from the beginning. I figured I could paint them sharper when the paint is dry later. During this time, the blue from the sky was actually dry, so I had to remix that color. I needed it in order to correct some issues with the bulb, but it was also useful in order to manipulate the thorns, whether it was to make them softer, sharper, or outright remove them. The sunlight has a lot to do on how sharp they are. Plus, I wanted some to recede into the sky in order to give this plant a sense of volume and depth. Just like the other thorns I did, this is very tedious and you have to be very careful. I definitely want to say that I did not copy the photo exactly. The goal was really just to mimic the texture. Now let's paint some detailed grass and some other plants as well. This is a close-up photo, and because of that, painting grass is not going to be as simple. Sometimes there's folds in the grass blade that you have to depict with a few twists and turns, and I had to use multiple colors of green as well. Same thing with the plants that are up close. But to simplify the process, the goal was to establish the overall shape of each plant or grass blade, and then use lights and darks in order to show the volume and sculpt them with paint. During this time, I'm also conscious to make sure I establish a division between the foreground plants and the background. And like before, I'm using highlights and some darks. For some of the more complex plants, I would actually paint an outline of them, and then afterwards I would render it with paint. I was always mindful of the direction of the sun and rendered the plants and grass accordingly. I made mistakes here and there, but I never was discouraged. I could always use the background color in order to correct things, especially if I wanted to manipulate the edges, whether it was to soften some in order to make them recede a little, or sharpen them so they could stand out. It all depended on how close some of these plants were to the viewer. I will be honest, initially I was trying to capture every plant I saw, but towards the end, I started to be more selective. The main reason was to keep the composition simple, and also it's quite stressful to actually try to paint as much detail as possible, especially if the canvas is only 12 by 16 inches. Now it is time to show you how I sign my artwork. I noticed this bulb had some string-like vine attached to it near the top, and I said to myself, this would be a very nice area to hide my signature. So instead of painting it the way I saw it in the photo, I manipulated the little vine into my signature and created two X's for my name in Greek as well as a 2 and a 4 for the year 2024. I tried to make it as subtle as possible because I never want my signature to be an eyesore, but instead be part of the composition. I'm definitely going to speed through this area because it's more of the same, which is painting more plants. This painting was definitely a very tedious one, and it required lots of patience as well as nerves of steel. In many ways, it was more challenging than the previous poppy painting I did. The other one was more like a typical landscape that I would do. And this one, since it's a close-up photo, I had to treat each plant like portraiture, especially since they were in the foreground and in a way the supporting cast for the poppies. Yes, I was fully aware that the poppies were going to be the stars, but I felt that the other plants also needed the same amount of attention. I felt like after I established most of the plants, then I could paint the poppies, knowing full well that most of the painting is already complete, allowing me to focus on making sure the stars were the brightest part of the composition. Alright, now it's time to slow down a bit. There were definitely sections in the painting that were like a jungle. What I mean by that is that there were lots of plants and grass just clustered together, but at the same time I had to try to make sense of them. In order to paint sections like this, I would always have to mix the color of the background. Edges also played a very important role, especially for the plants and grass blades that were further into the distance. I would have to give them a very soft touch. Even though I painted the ones in the foreground first, I would constantly go back into the background and soften the edges of some of the plants that were more in the distance. I definitely simplified this section from the photo. A strategy I used for the plants that were more in the distance was to paint the center of them and then just paint the background color around them. After that, I would dry brush. I would definitely use cooler tones of green and simplify the plants and grass blades. By doing that, I would create an optical illusion of depth and distance, especially if the plants that are closer in the foreground are more detailed and sharper. Also, by simplifying the background, it helped me not go insane from trying to capture all the detail in the photo. Right now, I am painting a seed pod. These were not that difficult to paint, but the cap was a little tricky. It had a bit of texture and some ridges. It also casted a light shadow on the rest of the body. In order for it to stand out against the background, I painted some highlights. As for the rest of the body of the seed pod, it wasn't just a flat green. I used directional brush strokes in order to, in a way, mimic the striations on it. It's a very subtle pattern of lines. These lines also helped create a sense of volume on the pod. The stem also had some bumps and curves too. It was not just a straight line to the seed pod. I used lights and darks in order to define it. I'm gonna speed through this section, mostly because I'm painting more of the same again. Now here are some more seed pods that I painted. Just like before, I am mindful of the lights and darks. In order to capture the striations on the seed pod, I am using directional brush strokes once again. I'm not copying the photo exactly how I see it, but I am alternating from different greens and using some titanium white as well in order to get some of the brighter striations. And once again, even though it's very subtle, the cap on the seed pod has a casted shadow. Now time to slow down a bit. I'll be honest again, I am not familiar with a lot of these different plants, but I do know this one has a lot of thorns. Earlier, I painted the outline of this plant in order to establish the overall body and get the leaves in the right spot. After that, I started to paint the plant with solid colors of green, but I was very mindful of the lights and darks in order to give it shape. When the paint was semi-dry, I started to apply the thorns. They appeared to be directional with the leaves. I did not copy the photo exactly, but I did my best to mimic the pattern of those little thorns. I was also mindful that the plant had some volume. Some leaves receded a little bit into the background, while others were closer to the viewing plane. I used lights and darks in order to distinguish the leaves from each other, especially with subtle highlights. The goal was not only to create the illusion of leaves, but also the thorns that were on it. Now time to paint another plant that I am not familiar with. It is somewhat similar to a poppy plant because it has bulbs, but lots of them. They appear to branch away from the stem and have lots of vines. The bulbs that I painted were all attached to them. I didn't exactly copy these bulb for bulb, but at one point I felt like I was on autopilot and I started to paint these as if I was in a assembly line, mass producing them. I pretty much applied green paint in order to create their shape, and then I used lights and darks in order to give them shape and form, as well as a sense of volume. The trickiest part was to paint the string-like hairs, and that required a very delicate touch. Once again, I used the background colors in order to correct them. And then there were the vines. I had to make sure that those pods connected in a way, and they were not a solid color. There was sections where the sunlight was hitting them directly, so I had to add highlights near the top and some darker darks near the bottom of the vines. I did not copy again the photo exactly. In this scenario, I was only using it as a reference in order to paint these bulbs. If anyone knows what these plants are, let me know. I'm curious. Now I'm going to speed through this section because, like before, it's more of the same. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. I know I have not begun to show how I painted the poppies, but I felt it is important to show that doing a painting like this is quite complicated, and even though that the poppies would end up being the main attraction, there was so much more that went into making it, such as the sky. Anyways, now time to show you what you all have been waiting for. How to paint very detailed thorns. I'm just kidding, the poppies of course. Let's start off with this fella. The first thing you will notice is I started out with orange, in acrylic to be more accurate. I got the basic shape of the poppies during the underpainting process. I used cadmium orange because I wanted these poppies to stand out and be very bright. But as for the oil part, I first start by correcting them a little bit. I reshaped the petals from the outside, and yes, if you notice, I made a few mistakes, and the red bled a little bit into the clouds. But I'm not too worried. In the end, I will correct this by repainting the sky and clouds nearby. For the very dark tones of red, I used alizarin crimson. And another important note, I did not use black. Instead, I used alizarin crimson either mixed with viridian or ultramarine blue. Note also how in the center there's also a seed pod. For now, I just painted the shape of it so I know where it is. And also towards the bottom of the petals on the right, there's these half circles. They are the beginning stages of some water drops that are dripping from the flower. There were actually quite a few of these water drops throughout the scenery, and I tried to capture as many as possible. I felt that they would be a nice touch to the realism. Once again, as I was trying to paint the water drops, some of the red bled into the clouds. I tried to correct them, but the clouds were becoming pink. So I figured I might as well wait later towards the end and just repaint this section and touch up all the little imperfections of the clouds. Another thing that I want to point out is that I did not just go straight and paint everything red on the petals. At first glance, to a typical person, they just look like they are red. But to people like us artists, we see striations, highlights, and different tones of red. That is why I started to paint the seed pod first. I wanted to get it out of the way before I started doing the red on the poppies. Anyhow, if you notice, I did do a very distinctive bold brush stroke for one of the petals. Plus, there's a very nice little fold on the very top. Unfortunately for this flower, it is missing a few petals, but it's okay. It gives me the opportunity to paint the inside of a poppy, and in a way to show that the world is not perfect. Plus, the center is not actually red. There's a lot of little tiny antennas that have little tiny seed pods on them. They surround the giant seed pod that's in the center. Two of them are very distinct in this painting. They are the two that are dangling on the bottom left of the flower. Now time to paint the petals a bit. Besides alizarin crimson, I used two other different reds. One was cadmium scarlet and the other one was cadmium red. For the brighter spots, I favored cadmium scarlet, especially for the inside of the poppy. Also take note that I did not paint the outer rim of the left petal. That was very intentional. Those are the locations of where the petal bends, and because of that, they are the brightest spots. I used a bit of titanium white mixed with cadmium red to lay out the base color of the highlight. After that, I started to integrate some of the cadmium red or cadmium scarlet that was nearby. Even though I was dry brushing in order to do this, the goal was not to get a smooth finish. There is actually a tiny bit of texture and striations visible. When necessary, I would reapply some bright titanium white to emphasize some of the speckles of highlights. Also, the body of the petal is not just a solid red. There are little folds that I try to distinguish with different tones of red. They are very subtle, but they are definitely there. I also began laying out the groundworks for the water drops that are inside the poppy petals. I used titanium white and cadmium yellow in order to do the highlights first. That way I know the center of the water drop. Afterwards, I started to paint the outer rim of the drop. The key to making a water drop very realistic is that it actually casts a shadow, even though it is see-through. To make it more believable, I made sure that the red on the top of the drop was lighter than the red on the bottom. Also, they require a gentle touch. I did not want them to be too distracted, so I made sure they had soft edges by dry brushing the neighboring reds. Another trick is to make sure the center is actually darker than the surrounding colors, but not by much, of course. But the highlight will be what makes or breaks the water drop. Now let me talk about painting the petals again. Just like everything that you will try to paint, whether it's a human, a car, or a poppy like this video, lights and darks make all the difference on giving something shape and form. Since the petal on the right bends a little, it's a little darker underneath. Besides the bend, I also tried to capture the folds. I believe I used pure cadmium orange for the part of the fold that stuck out and got hit by sunlight, but I definitely used alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue for the darker reds. You will notice some folds are sharper than others, especially the one on the middle of the right petal. To emphasize the sharpness, I made sure to paint a very dark line of red where the light and dark of the fold meet. In a way, I increased the contrast in order to give it a sharper look, but for the more subtle folds, I would gently dry brush. After laying out lights and darks for the folds, it is time to add the final touches to the petals, which is lots and lots of lines to depict the striations of the flower's petals. Colors I used were cadmium yellow, orange, and red, as well as alizarin crimson too. For some of the extreme brights, I used titanium white with a tad bit of cadmium orange, especially around the highlights, or where the sun was hitting the flower directly. One of the more trickier parts of painting the right petal was the edge, especially where it meets the left petal. It is a very subtle color difference between the two petals that keeps them separated from each other. And also to make that fold on the top right petal stand out more, I increased the brightness of where the sunlight hit it, especially around the edges. And then I increased the darkness a little more underneath. Now let me talk about the striations, or the light texture that is found on the petals of the poppy. In order to pull off this illusion, I did lots and lots of line work. I also worked mostly wet on wet. By doing so, it made sure that the striations were not too sharp. During the process, some of the folds eventually disappeared, and because of that, I would have to repaint them. But instead of applying bodies of color, I used line work, whether it was darks or lights, or in between. And in order to get the lights, I wouldn't just use white. Sometimes it was pure cadmium yellow or orange. And when I felt it needed to be more red, cadmium red. But the key was to follow the direction of the petals, and also to be mindful of the folds, whether they are small or large. Now let's fast forward to the next poppy, because I know you do not want to watch boring old plain plants. Unless you do, let me know in the comments. I have another painting I have not done videos for yet. Now here is another poppy that is missing quite a few petals, though I'm going to speed through this one a little bit. Like before, I start to reshape the petals, and then I start to use lights and darks in order to give them shape and form. I'm also mindful that there's a little drop of water that's about to fall on the left petal, but that is not the only one. There's also some drops underneath the right petal as well as on the side. Like before, I'm also directional with my brush strokes. That way I can mimic the striations of the petals. The trickiest part of painting this flower were the edges, especially in order to depict the two different sides of each petal. In order to pull off this illusion, I used extreme brights, whether it was a highlight or a very bright red, on the side of the petal that the sun was hitting, and made sure to darken underneath the petal as much as possible. The right petal also casted a light shadow on the left one, a very tiny one. And like before, in order to paint the other water drops, I painted the center highlights first. In this scenario, the ones that were underneath the right petal were reflecting the bright red from the poppy on the left. After establishing the centers, I would paint the rims around the drops. But since these were underneath the petals, I made sure the drops were very blurry by dry brushing the borders of each drop. If they were in the sunlight, they would have definitely been sharper. As for the drops that were on the right, I tried to make sure some of the green was visible because water is see-through after all, but also because they are reflecting the bright white from the clouds. I used a tad bit of titanium white with cadmium orange. I used that same white also for the highlights that are on the top of each poppy petal in order to paint the highlights in the striations. At one point, the highlights in the striations overpowered the dark ones. After the paint dried a bit, I went back into this section and repainted the darker striations. But in order to paint the thorns underneath the right petal, I had to make sure the dark red was wet. That way I was able to get a nice blurry soft touch for each thorn I painted. Just like the drops that were underneath the petal, they are softer and more blurry because they are in the shade and not in direct sunlight. Anyhow, on to another poppy. This one is actually facing away from us. Same as before, I start to correct the petals. Of all the poppies, this was definitely the easiest one to paint. A notable feature I tried to capture was the clover-like black pattern on the back. And like before, I tried to distinguish each and every fold of the petals by using lights and darks to shape them out. None of them were too crazy on this flower. If anything, they were pretty straightforward and required more of a soft touch to paint them. Same thing with the clover-like pattern. After establishing where it is, I dry brushed the surrounding colors so it does not stand out too much. But if there was one thing tricky about painting this one, it was the stem that connected to the flower, which happened to be in the center of the clover-like pattern. I had to gently paint the center where the stem met the clover, and I added the appropriate colors and highlights so it stood out a little bit and protruded away from the flower. Another notable challenge was the grass blade that was in front. I believe I definitely had to repaint this section towards the end because I got some of the red where I did not want it to be. Even though they're not that noticeable on this poppy, I still use directional brush strokes, especially in key areas, to define the petals. But I feel one of the most clever details I included was a little gap between two petals where the sky is visible. It is a little bit to the right of the stem, and in order to pull off this illusion, I painted the petals nearby and tried to define the edges very carefully so the viewer knows there's a separation. But as for the gap, when the paint was more dry, I went back and repainted the cloud color. Another optical illusion I wanted to create was a sense of depth. That is why I painted the petals of the flower with a softer touch and made them a little bit blurry. But as for the connecting stem, I tried to make it more defined and stand out with a few highlights, especially since it is closer to the viewer than the flower itself. Now on to another poppy, or should I say two of them? I am not too sure, but my suspicions were that it was two separate poppies here. This was actually one of the more tricky poppies to paint, not because it was possibly two different flowers, but because of all the different plants that were in front of them. Because of that, it required multiple takes. Especially if I needed to repaint sections, I pretty much had to wait for the paint to dry. Red is a very powerful color. Not only does it grab your attention more than anything else, but if it's mixed with neighboring colors, it is hard to remove unless you repaint that section. And the best time to do it is when the paint dries later on, especially when painting the hairs of those bulbs. I had to make sure they were very sharp, and if I painted directly on the red of the poppy, they would have became pink. One thing I did like about this particular poppy was that the water drops were very clear. Since they were on the very top of the flower, they were very clear because the sun was hitting them directly. Unlike the ones that recede a bit that were underneath the petal of the previous poppy, these water drops were more sharper and vivid. Plus, there was more contrast as well. Also, another thing I want to point out is that later on, I will darken part of the stem that is directly underneath the petals. Not by much, but just enough so there's the illusion that it is beneath the flower's body and that there's a shadow being casted. Now on to the last poppy, which not only is the biggest one, but also the closest to the viewer. And you know what that means? More refined detail. But I am going to speed through this section. I only laid out a few bodies of color to get the poppy started. Overall, it was pretty straightforward to do it, but the texture is a different story. Also, another notable characteristic of this one is that one petal is clearly visible and the other one recedes a bit. Anyhow, after establishing the lights and darks and then some of the striations, I decided to shift my attention and paint some of the plants that were in the painting. There are other plants besides these poppies after all. So I went back and did some touch-ups, added some thorns here and there, and redid some sections, especially those areas where I was waiting for the paint to dry. Quite a lot of work went into doing this painting, though it was very simple looking at first. At one point I realized what a challenge it would be, and it required some patience, especially painting thin lines of paint, whether it was for the vines or the hairs on the bulbs. Plus, at times I was trying not to get lost, especially with all the plants, stems, and grass. There were definitely sections where in a way they interlocked. I had to paint very carefully in those sections, and use soft and hard edges in the right areas to make the ones that were in the back recede and the ones that are more closer to the viewer stand out. I went back into even the vines. I added some highlights to them, especially since they were not smooth cylinders. And besides adding more of them, I also had to touch up a lot of the thorns. Anyhow, let's finish this poppy I began. I'm gonna speed through this one as well, especially since it is more of the same. One of the biggest differences when painting this poppy is the texture. Since it is a lot closer, more is visible. I spent quite a bit of time building up all the striations, as well as little bits of color that I saw throughout the petals. Like before, I used 3 different reds: alizarin crimson, cadmium red, and also cadmium scarlet. Besides the reds, I also used cadmium orange and yellow. And for the darks, I used ultramarine blue mixed with alizarin crimson. But for the extreme darks, I used alizarin crimson and viridian, but I did this in the absolute end. And besides the texture, I definitely want to point out the difference between the water drops. The ones that are on the bottom are actually clear, and you can see the background a little bit through them, but the other ones are not, especially on the body of the petal. They also do not reflect the sky too much. In other words, when doing water drops, pay attention to the surrounding area where they are. That will help you determine what is reflecting off the water drop and what you can see through it. There was also a lot of different folds on the petals as well. They were very intricate in many spots. But I feel the most interesting thing I tried to depict in this painting were these little highlights that were found on the petals. They were definitely more visible on this last poppy because it was a lot closer. At one point I was considering not doing them, but I thought that it would add to the realism if I did. At first, I practically used pure cadmium yellow, and during the process, instead of dry brushing, I would use little brush strokes in order to, in a way, intertwine with the yellow. But towards the end, I used titanium white mixed with a tad bit of cadmium orange to create little highlights. And again, instead of dry brushing, I used tiny brush strokes that intertwined with the yellow and white. If anything, I barely used any dry brushing for the entire poppy because I knew how important it was to show the visible texture. That is why instead I used lots and lots of little brush strokes. And here is a close-up of one of the poppy bulbs. I waited for the paint to dry a bit before I started to do touch-ups. There is so much you could do when the paint is wet, especially for sharp thorns. But in order to get certain effects, I had to repaint parts of the sky that surround the bulb, especially to get a soft edge of where the bulb and sky meet, and that involved painting between the thorns. And also, to show that it is not a pure cylinder, I made sure to paint some of the imperfections of the stem. I practically mimicked the texture I saw versus copying the photo in this scenario, and I also factored that some of the thorns are not just left and right. Some stick out straight, and some are at an angle. Variation was the key. And lastly, the little dimples that are found on the bulb itself. I touched up those as well by adding some bright highlights and also by sharpening some of the thorns that stuck out from them. Of all the bulbs, this one stood out the most, especially since it is very tall. That is why I spent quite a bit of time detailing this particular one. Now it is time to conclude this video. It was a lot of touch-ups towards the end, a lot of refining. At one point, I had to touch up the sky and clouds, but it's okay. During this time, I was able to correct things, such as the red that bled through, and I was able to adjust some of the thorns, whether it was to blur or sharpen some. Anyhow, as you can see, a lot went into making this painting. Yes, the poppies will definitely get all the glory, but honestly, I don't think they would have stood out so much if it wasn't for the supporting cast of all the plants. I felt ignoring the rest of the plants would have been in a way ignoring reality, which is why I gave the rest of the plants almost as much attention. Sure, it was definitely tedious to do, but I was up for the challenge. So much that the next painting I attempt was similar in a way, but it has 10 times more plants. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching, especially since this is the longest video I have done to date. And this painting was definitely different from what I usually do. I rarely do close-ups, and I swear I was not aiming for realism. It just happened. For more of my work, check out my Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course. Anyhow, until next time, bye.